Meanwhile, we'll move over to Venezuela, where a political crisis is engulfing that country and appears no closer to a resolution. If anything, the uncertainty over who is in charge is escalating.
Bueno, alerto al pueblo de Venezuela que se está llevando.
The country's defense minister warned today a coup is underway and threw his support behind President Nicolas Maduro. He also denounced Juan Guaido, the opposition leader who yesterday declared himself president. Canada has joined the U.S. and several other Latin American countries and is backing Guaido, but not everyone in Canada agrees with that move. The CBC's Evan Dyer is watching this story for us. Hey, Evan, thanks for being here.
Hi, Vashi.
First of all, let's go over the reasons why Canada is backing Guaido.
Well, it has to do partly with the Venezuelan constitution and partly with the history of the last few years. So, in a nutshell, it's because Canada sees him as the most senior elected official in Venezuela who can trace his mandate back to a free election. And that is because he was elected in the 2015 National Assembly election, which elected a large opposition majority, and that's the last election that Canada accepted as legitimate. And then his fellow legislators elected him to be their president. And as in the U.S. Constitution, where Nancy Pelosi would be in line to assume the presidency as Speaker of the House, if for some reason the executive couldn't continue in power, he, as Speaker of the Venezuelan National Assembly, would have the same role under that country's constitution. But of course, the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, who Canada considers the president de facto, insists that he is still the president and that there's no reason for Juan Guaido to step up. And also, Juan Guaido has no real powers. He's actually having to keep his location secret just to avoid arrest. And, you know, the assembly has been stripped of powers now for 3 years and has had an alternative assembly set up in its place, which is the one that is recognized by the government. So he's in a tough position when it comes to making his legitimate power real power.
And countries kind of around the world are lining up behind, I guess I don't want to call it a side, I don't want to diminish it, but essentially there is a long list behind, you know, agreeing with Canada's position and
That's right.
A shorter list on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, just within the last hour, we saw Germany recognize Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela, following the same logic that Canada followed. You know, there's a list of American countries that are backing Nicolas Maduro: Nicaragua, El Salvador. Mexico and Uruguay are sort of on the fence, but they are at least recognizing his government. And of course, Cuba, Bolivia, traditional allies, them as well. But if you really look at a map of our hemisphere, you know, in terms of land mass, in terms of population, you're looking at well over 90% now supporting Guaido. I mean, two countries which have more than half of the population of the Americas, Brazil and the United States, were among the first to recognize Juan Guaido. So in terms of international support within the hemisphere, he's in a strong position. But the Nicolas Maduro regime still has strong support from Russia, which has given it a lot of arms, from China, which gives it loans and technology. It has some other partners too, Iran, Turkey, and so on outside of the hemisphere. And of course, within the country, as we saw, General Pedrino Lopez there, the Minister of Defense, and all the senior command of the army are party members, and their loyalties are not in any doubt. The loyalties of the junior officers and the ranks under them, those are in doubt.
You mentioned two of the big powers backing Guaido, Brazil and the United States. Those are also two of the countries singled out by the NDP in this country as a reason not to be supportive of the action that Canada is taking. Tell us a bit about what those politicians are saying. Well,
we've been watching a split sort of evolving in the NDP all day over this issue, and it really began when Sven Robinson, who is now a candidate, of course, and staging a bit of a comeback, came out and let it be known that he was happy to take questions on Venezuela, and let's have a look at some of what he had to say.
It is shameful that the government of Canada and Justin Trudeau is lining up with Donald Trump, with the authoritarian thug Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, and is in fact recognizing a coup, an illegal coup. This is not respecting the people of Venezuela.
Let's look at another little bit of similar thinking from another member of the NDP, a prominent member who is in caucus. Nikki Ashton put out a tweet. PM Trudeau sides with Trump's regime change agenda and Brazil's fascist president, Jair Bolsonaro, in support of someone calling for a military coup in Venezuela. That would be Juan Guaido. No, we cannot support an agenda of economic or military coups. Hands off Venezuela. So this sort of represents the left of the party. The official foreign affairs critic of the NDP, Hélène Laverdière, has been very critical of the Maduro regime, but seems to be out of step with the left of the party. We haven't been able to speak to her today. Her scheduling conflicts apparently make that unavailable.
Anyone from the NDP.
Anyone from the NDP.
Requested everyone.
Sven Robinson has been the only one so far who's willing to go.
And the party, I think, says he doesn't speak for
doesn't
them
speak for
because
them,
he's a
no.
candidate.
That's right. And another candidate in one of the upcoming by-elections, York Simcoe, was also tweeting hands off Venezuela too. So you can see the split.
And we did see a statement from Jagmeet Singh as
We
well,
did.
where he sort of took the middle ground, but not really. I mean, he did caution against, I think the wording was simply following the U.S.
He did. In fact, let's have a look at that statement. He said, where do I have that thing? He said Canada, first of all, he said that the Maduro regime should not shoot protesters. He said, protesting cannot be synonymous with death. But then he went on, Canada should not simply follow the U.S.'s foreign policy, particularly given its history of self-interested interference in the region. And he went on to say the question of who is to lead Venezuela should be in the hands of Venezuelans. But it's not clear what that means, because in practice, in international affairs, you do have to recognize a government. And while the NDP is saying we wouldn't recognize either, if you take no action, then the pre-existing recognition of the Maduro government stands. And Canada would be in that other column with Bolivia, Cuba, Russia, Iran, and so on, recognizing Maduro until the moment that a government of Canada chooses to break relations. That would be the situation. And so it's a sign of the sort of the horns of the dilemma the NDP finds itself on.
All right, thank you, Evan. The CBC's Evan Dyer. Now, let's get some context to Canada's response to this crisis. Is this the appropriate reaction to the situation? Ben Rosewell is Canada's most recent ambassador to Venezuela, now president of the Canadian International Council, and he's here in studio with us. Thank you very much, Mr. Rosewell.
Real
nice
pleasure
to
to be
see
here.
you. I appreciate it. Did Canada make the right move in recognizing or endorsing, I'm not sure what the right word is, hopefully you can correct me, the opposition leader in Venezuela?
I think so, very much. I should point out that what Canada is doing is actually supporting the National Assembly, which is the last remaining democratically elected institution of the Venezuelan government. So in doing so, it's supporting democracy. Now, one of the greatest challenges in foreign policy is to be consistent from one country to the next, and particularly when you're talking about democracy, that's always a real challenge. Like, how do you actually stand up for democracy as a country like Canada? I think this is what we're doing in Venezuela, even when it's difficult and even when it involves some sort of risk. We don't know yet whether this new interim president will actually end up enjoying the support of the armed forces, or whether they will stay with the current president, whether it will resolve itself peacefully or whether it will end up in some kind of violence. So it's definitely a risky move, but this is the kind of thing that a government does when it's willing to stand on principle, and that's something that I think this government can be saluted for.
Can I ask you about the distinguishment that you're making between the National Assembly and the person that we all watched yesterday declare himself president? In recognizing him, how is that different than what you're saying, or is it?
No, what I'm saying is that the decision by these Latin American countries plus Canada, the Lima Group, yesterday was to recognize that there is a vacuum in the leadership of Venezuela, that the constitution has been suspended more or less, and so the only way to ensure that the people of Venezuela have some kind of authorities that they support, that they recognize the legitimacy of that, is to go to the institution that has most recently had been elected through a free and fair election, and that was the National Assembly. Juan Guaido is where he is simply because he's the speaker of that National Assembly. It's not because the other Latin American countries and Canada just sort of picked someone and said, we like the way this guy looks. It's the mandate that comes up from the citizens to the National Assembly and to its speaker that is now the only thing that Venezuela has that could approximate a legitimate government.
I think that's an important point, though, because a lot of criticism that you hear right now is that this is evocative of what's happened in the past, in that the U.S. is just putting someone in power in order to assert its own authority. So what do you make of that criticism, I guess, in light of what you've just said?
I think as Canadians, we often seem to think that everything's about the United States, and it's just not. You know, this is a story about Venezuelans. Venezuelans have been taking to the streets time after time after time throughout the Maduro presidency because they want to be able to choose their government. Now, you do have a very, frankly, loudmouthed American president who's always trying to insert himself into the story, and yet again, the president said something really controversial yesterday just to make sure that his name gets to the sort of top of the fold and that we're talking about what he's doing. But what's really happening in Venezuela is about Venezuelans. It doesn't really have very much to do with the United States at all. This is a citizenry, a population that has experienced an economic crisis that's twice or three times as severe as we ever had during the Great Depression. They are desperate to change their government. And sure, there's a lot of international voices. There are other countries in the world saying, that's totally legitimate that you would want to change your government. One of them comes from Donald Trump, but this doesn't make it a story about the United States. It's a story about Venezuela.
On that, the Canadian position has not gone unopposed. The federal government's position has not gone unopposed. The NDP, for example, its leader Jagmeet Singh is saying that Canada should not simply follow what the U.S. is doing. Do you think that's what's happening here?
Canada's not following what the United States is doing. The United States irresponsibly has said that they would be willing to consider all options to address the situation in Venezuela.
Including military.
Including military, which is outrageous and wrong, and Canada's not saying that at all. What Canada's been doing, we're not following anyone. In fact, we've probably been leading. We were one of the principal governments that formed the Lima Group back in 2017. The second or third meeting of the Lima Group was in Toronto. We have consistently been working with Latin American countries to make sure that there's a regional consensus approach to what's happening, and that's not following Washington. Washington's not even in the Lima Group. Like, we're the ones that are working with the Peruvians, with the Colombians, with the Brazilians, with the Argentinians, with the Chileans. You know, the United States is not even at the table. But because President Trump tends to get a lot of press, as soon as he opens up his mouth, all of a sudden it becomes a U.S. story. This is not a U.S. story. It's a Venezuelan story. It's a Latin American story. And we are there supporting Venezuelans and Latin Americans.
So in Venezuela, because you've spent so much time there, help us understand what happens next. I mean, I'm sure it's impossible to predict, but from the outside, it looks like such a stalemate, because you've got Maduro digging his heels in, you've got people protesting, obviously, and the advent of the leader of the opposition. How do you expect this plays out?
I definitely cannot predict. This is a highly unusual situation for one country to have two presidents, and obviously only one armed forces. That situation is going to resolve itself one way or the other, and I think it's impossible for us to predict. There have been a few things that have been surprising. The first is that a man could stand on a stage in downtown Caracas, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people, and swear an oath on a constitution with a picture of Simón Bolívar and Venezuelan flags all over, and say, "I am the legitimate interim president of the United States," and the armed forces do nothing. I salute them for their restraint. It was a potentially very dangerous situation. The armed forces did not move in. They did not arrest him. They did not fire at the protesters as they had done in previous mass protests.
And even though officially they support Maduro, they didn't.
They're saying that they support Maduro,
But they haven't shown.
but they haven't actually deployed their forces in any way to try and arrest this person whose authority they do not recognize, or they do not yet recognize. So there's clearly some confusion on the ground about what's happening and where the winds will turn. One thing I have learned about the Venezuelan armed forces, just from talking to Venezuelan historians, is that they tend to be an institution that is highly pragmatic, and that will side with whoever they think the winner is. So they have stayed with Maduro despite the economic calamity, presumably because some of calculation that he was able to stay in power. But the fact that they're not now taking action visibly could lead you to believe that maybe they're starting to make those calculations. I really can't speculate, because it's also probably the most inscrutable armed forces in the world. Like, no one knows what's going on inside the Venezuelan armed forces. But it is very strange that there's now been a full 24 hours that have gone, and there's still a guy walking around downtown Caracas saying, "I'm the interim president of Venezuela, and Nicolas Maduro is not."
All right, thank you so much for your time, Mr. Roosevelt.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Hope to have you back during this as it continues.